Someone shot and killed preacher Marion Estep in his car along the Hal Rogers Parkway in Perry County. Today, there is still no killer behind bars, still no leads, and no answers for his family.
Eastern Kentucky is a happy place for many people. The mountains, the valleys, the community. And it was a home for Marion Estep, a local minister who was beloved by many.
To me, he was my walking buddy. We would take walks all the time down the little holler he lived in. So we would take walks, and he was my friend. My grandma babysat me a lot, so he was always there, kind of in and out, hanging out. He was gentle and very kind and funny. Like, we always just had a hoot and we had a good time.
Estep had more than 50 years experience preaching and pastoring throughout multiple churches in Perry County. The people of Eastern Kentucky loved hearing him speak.
They loved him. Back in the old days, my parents said that people would come to hear him preach, and the little churches would be so full that people would stand and look through the windows when he preached. So that's kind of neat.
But January 10th, 2008, the Perry County community was stunned when the beloved minister was murdered.
Estep was visiting with his family in the Chavis community with intentions of heading home to Jackson for supper with his wife, but he never made it back. His car was found near exit 56 on the Hal Rogers Parkway. He had been shot 4 times. There were signs of a struggle.
It was a big shock, just for that to happen, and to happen to someone such as my grandfather. And, still to this day, people ask me about that. So over the long as it's been, over a decade that's been, I still get to this day, people still ask about it.
Estep was shot once in the head and 3 times in the chest. When he was found, he was still fighting for his life. He would be rushed into the hospital and into surgery, but he was pronounced dead at 3 a.m. the next morning.
We got a call saying that he was in the hospital, that something bad had happened and that he was in the hospital. So my mom, was freaking out and sent me to my grandma's side. My dad's mom sent me down to her house. So that's where I went to stay for the evening until they got back from the hospital. And I remember I was in the back room, I think taking a nap, and I heard my grandma say that he was killed, that he had been murdered. And at a young age of 10, I was absolutely broke down, absolutely tore all to pieces. It was awful. And so from a very young age, it was very distressing to hear that my grandpa had been murdered, just in the next room, just this conversation.
While there was evidence of a struggle in the car, most everything was left alone, except for one item that was never recovered.
He took that Bible with him everywhere he went. So, and in that Bible, he had written things about just funeral arrangements and things he'd wanted done there. That's how we knew that the Bible was missing, because he'd wrote all of his funeral plans out and other things in that Bible, because he knew that the family would go there to look.
Leaving Chavis and heading to Jackson would mean Estep would have to take a left turn onto Highway 15, but he must have taken a right and driven 10 minutes out of his way to end up near exit 56.
Estep's loved ones say he lived out his faith every day of his life and showed compassion to people he didn't even know. Many fear that compassion could have led to his death in 2008.
He'd be driving down the road and he'd see somebody. It was a lot more common back then and before than what it is now. We live in a day and time now where we won't hardly pick up people we know, let alone strangers. Back then, it was more common, but he'd see people walking, he'd pick them up, give them a ride, buy them a meal, give them the last dollar he'd have. He's that type of guy.
And even though Estep's grandson is the top law man in the county, he understands it will take some help from someone to crack the case.
At this point, it's just going to take a confession. Someone would have to step up and provide the details and confess to it after this much time had went by. If somebody was there, maybe someone had confessed to them, but along with that, without the actual person confessing to it, that they would need to be some type of other evidence or something that would prove that.
And while there are plenty of reasons to be angry and upset, his family is focused on living out his legacy.
He'd always told me, since I was a little bitty boy, he'd always told me, he said, "You're going to be a preacher when you grow up." And, every time I'd go over to his house and visit, he'd tell me that. And, I just always kind of shook it off and never did. But he'd always ask me, he said, I want you to, not long before he died, the years leading up to his death, and I was an adult, I'd go to church with him. He'd be like, "I don't want you to preach my funeral." And I was like, "Well, I don't know how to preach." And he said, you just do it. Get up there and read some scriptures and do it. But coinciding with the time of his death, about the time that I felt the calling to preach, and my first message was at his funeral, and started then and never looked back.
While the family deals without knowing for sure what happened that day in 2008.
They hope for closure, and his granddaughter has a message for the person responsible.
I would want them to know that my grandpa probably forgives them, and he probably wants them in heaven with him, and he doesn't want anything bad to happen to them. Like, he just wants them to know God and know who he is. And I would want them to know that even though they've done this horrible and this bad thing, that if they did come forward and they did confess that they did it and said they did, then it would mean a lot to us. You're finally figuring out who did this after so many years. I mean, this happened in 2008. It's 2022. Like, it's been years and years. So I think it would mean a lot.
Next January will make 15 years since Estep's death. If you know anything about his murder, call Kentucky State Police Post 13 or the Perry County Sheriff's Office, or you can send an anonymous tip to us here at Eastern Kentucky Cold Case. Send your tips to ekycoldcase@gmail.com.